Good morning, everyone. When I was getting this cup this morning, I grabbed the wrong straw, so it's too short for the lid to be on. This is our fourth week over the book of Judges. So, as a refresher, the judges are not the judges that we typically know today with lawyers in a courtroom and the court justice system, but rather they're regional political military leaders that were like tribal chieftains. And before today, we looked at Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, and now we are looking at Gideon. So if you want to open your Bibles up to Judges 6, that is what we're going to be going over today. Darren mentioned last week how this book tends to repeat itself. The beginning of a new judge calls on the Lord for help after X amount of years of pain or suffering. And that's no different here. It's repeating over and over again. Who has heard the saying, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me"? I have. My grandma thought it was fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on you. But whenever you stop and think about it, fool me once, shame on you. Oh, fool, shame on you. You fooled me. But fool me twice, shame on me. Ah, you fooled me again. I should have learned the first time. What about if it happens again? Fool me 3 times? Does it shame me again, or does it go to like someone else? You fooled me 3 times. Shame on you, Erica. Oh, you fooled me 4 times. Shame on you, Jay. But what happens if it happens again? 3 times, 4 times? Hopefully after the 3rd time you learn that what you're doing is wrong. It's foolish. Fooled me 3 times. Okay, you won't fool me the 4th time. Oh man, you fooled me again. I tend to do that a lot, not be fooled multiple times, but I tend to learn from it after the 1st time. And if not the 1st time, then I'll definitely learn after the 2nd time. Reinforcement is what some of you might think of. Doing something over and over again until something finally sticks. In Israel's case, in Judges, it's calling on God. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Because it happens again and again. While we need to call on God when we do evil or do wrong, or when we hurt, or we need courage, or when we need encouragement, God gives us strength when we are weak and when we are fearful. Israel did evil here. And then here comes this new judge, Gideon, who wasn't the typical macho man that you think of. He didn't have a burly beard or a really thick mustache. He didn't ride a Harley Davidson, although that would have been impressive if he did. He was quite a coward who had many doubts. First, we will look at the introduction to Gideon and his initial fear and doubts. Then Gideon's calling to victory over the Midianites, the enemy. And finally, we will look at lessons on trusting God's strength in our weakness and the fall of Israel again. And we need to look at that for our section today. Like I said, this is the judge of Gideon in Judges 6. That's where we will be starting. And you might want to keep track because Gideon's story lasts 3 chapters. So this is a long one. If you have to go to the bathroom, now's a good time to do it. If you have some popcorn, it'd be good. Get comfortable. Get a drink. So, with the short amount of time that I have, let's quit wasting time because I only have half an hour to do this. And when I was rehearsing this last night while doing my laundry, I usually finish my sermons before the washer is done, but the washer got done before me. We know that Israel did evil in the Lord's sight before. And look at what they're doing now. Judges 6:1. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. Stop! Seriously, Are you are you serious? Are you kidding me? Out of everything you could have done, you chose to do this. You chose to do evil in the Lord's sight, which, to be fair, there is no hiding from God. You can't hide under a bridge and just say, oh, God can't see me, because, well, God can't see you, so shame on you. How many times do we need to do this dance? Over and over again. Reinforcement. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me again and again. But believe it or not, God could have handed the Israelites over to a foe that would have slaughtered them. But instead, God handed them over to the Midianites, which was showing God's grace and mercy. But Harrison, you ask, how does that make sense? He handed the Israelites over to the enemy, the Midianites. Well, sometimes God puts us through situations so we can call on Him. Sometimes God will put us in a crucible so that way we can call on God for help. It would have been worse if God just left them alone. I've done this dance too many times with the Israelites. They can do whatever they want. Well, then they wouldn't have learned. They would have continued to do evil in the Lord's sight. How many times do you need to hear something to learn from it? 2 times? 3 times? Maybe it happens over and over again. Maybe you heard something in school so many times, but yet you couldn't remember it for the life of you. Maybe it happens over and over again, but eventually you learn it and you find a pattern as to why this thing is happening over and over again, as to why you can't remember it. Or maybe God puts you in a sticky situation so that way you can call on Him. Has the Lord ever put you through a situation like that? Has God ever put you in a crucible? Has God ever done something that you didn't like, but it was through that situation, it was through that crucible that you called on Him? Have you ever done that? Has that ever happened to you? Hopefully it didn't last 7 years like the Israelites with the Midianites here. But it was long enough for you to think, hey, you know what? I'm not feeling the best. I feel really far away from God. Let me call on Him. Let me call on God. So that was just the first verse. We know that Israel did bad again and was handed over for 7 years. What next? Well, because of my time, because I can't read every verse in these chapters, let's skip to verse 11. And because I can't read every verse, we're going to play catch up a little bit. Marauders would attack the Israel's crops, which they were reduced to starvation because of that. They didn't have enough to eat. Then and only then, after that, after they were starved, they cried out to God, who sent a prophet who told the Israelites this: God saved you many times. God saved you many times, and He only told you to do one thing. Do not worship Amorite gods, but yet you did not listen. Look at you now. You're worshiping Amorite gods. Let's pick up at verse 11. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all of this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." This is a long sermon, so I need to quench my thirst. Verse 11, that section that I just read, that is the introduction, and we are introduced to the new judge, Gideon. And I would like to point out here that the angel that talks to him is not just any angel, but rather God Himself. It is an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ appearing in human form, speaking to Gideon before Jesus' incarnation in Bethlehem. And how do I know this? Well, I do my research, and because verse 14, then the Lord turned to him and said, and verse 16, which I didn't read, but you can look, then the Lord said to him. Gideon is called a mighty hero here. Mighty hero or a mighty valor, which is something that he wouldn't really consider himself to be. Oh, I'm not a hero. I'm not a mighty valor. But he's called that, and he questions this angel of the Lord. He questions God. If the Lord is with us, why were we handed over to the Midianites? That is the age-old question that a lot of people ask. If God is real, if he is with us, why does the world suck? Why were we handed over to the Midianites? Gideon knew the stories of old. He knew about God freeing them out of Egypt, the musical number where Moses tells Pharaoh to let his people go, and he knew God was good. But yet, he was stuck doing this humiliating and kind of difficult job of threshing wheat. And threshing wheat is the process of loosening the edible part of a grain from the straw to which it is attached. And if you know what wheat looks like, there are multiple grains in a single straw. Now here's the thing about Gideon, which a lot of people could relate to, is that he was doubtful. He wouldn't call himself a hero, and he wanted proof that he was talking to God, and proof that God was with him, and proof that what he is hearing is true, that God will be with Gideon to rescue Israel. Let's look at verse 17. Verse 17, Gideon replied, if you are truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. He wants proof because he's doubtful. Sometimes I get doubtful. Sometimes I feel like I might be let down, so I want proof that I won't be let down. He wanted proof, which is understandable. You want proof or a sign where you've been let down so many times. And Gideon here has been let down. He's more than 7 years old, so he was present whenever God handed them over to the Midianites. He was there whenever people came and pillaged his crops. So Gideon went home to get the proof. He went home, made some food, and brought it back. But man, that probably took a few hours to do, a few hours to make that food. Not only was he probably stopped by multiple people asking what he is doing, but they were probably stopping him and asking, why are you making food? We have very limited food as it is, Gideon. Stop. Turn the oven off. Turn the stove off. Put the food back in the pantry. Go. Leave. They probably said that. But Gideon here gets his proof in verse 21. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff in his hand, and fire flamed up from the rock and consumed all he had brought, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. How crazy would that be? To be doubtful, thinking that what you're doing is crazy, that you're going to be in so much trouble making all this food, where you spent so much time making the food, all the dishes that you have to clean now, making sure that you turn the oven off, all for the food that you made to be burnt to a crisp. A look of shock. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I spent so long making that. Do you know how many dishes I have to do? I had to look at the cookbook for it. A cookbook. But there's the proof for Gideon. There's the proof that Gideon needed. God gives us strength when we are weak and when we are fearful. Not just physically weak, but weak in our faith, when we are doubtful. I'm an overthinker. I try not to be, but I am. Sometimes I stay up late just thinking about the day or tomorrow or something else. Or sometimes I'll even just stare off into space thinking about the day or tomorrow or something else. I feel like Gideon would also be an overthinker, especially when it comes to what just happened with all the food burning up. Now let's skip to later in this chapter. Now remember, the previous judges were only about half to 2 chapters, whereas Gideon takes up 3 chapters to tell his story. So if you don't have popcorn, I'm sorry. Now, while everyone was asleep, Gideon pulled down his father's altar of Baal, and he cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it, and he replaced it with an altar to God, and he sacrificed a young bull as a burnt offering. And in the morning, the townspeople came and they were mad because they found out that it was Gideon, the son of Joash, and they wanted to kill Gideon for what he did. Now let's pick up at verse 31. But Joash shouted to the mob that confronted him, "Why are you defending Baal? Will you argue his case? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If Baal truly is a god, let him defend himself and destroy the one who broke down his altar." From then on, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, which means let Baal defend himself, because he broke down Baal's altar. What Joash said here, all the questions that he asked, is very logical, and it is a test to this God with little g, God that people worship. If Baal truly was a god, let him defend himself. And that title Gideon was given, Jerubbaal, is a title of honor. And that is twice that Gideon is given a title that he thinks that he doesn't deserve. The first was hero, mighty valor, and now this title of honor, Jerubbaal. Now the armies of Midian, Amalek, and armies from the east, they are out for Israel now. So to combat that, Gideon summoned a call to arms the men of the clan of Abiezer, Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. But once more, Gideon was doubtful and fearful. Let me read the rest of this chapter, verse 36. Then Gideon said to God, "If you are truly going to use me to rescue Israel as you promised, prove it to me in this way. I will put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you are going to help me rescue Israel as you promised." And that is just what happened. When Gideon got up early the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out a whole bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Please don't be angry with me, but let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece for one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew." So that night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew. This right here, the end of this chapter, is the rising action. Two huge armies ready to fight, led by a man who had a weak, imperfect faith, asking for a sign from God, not once, not twice, but 3 times. 3 times Gideon asked God for a sign. A single one, a single sign, that would have been understandable. It would have been encouraging, but asking a second and a third time? Like, come on, you already saw your food get burnt to a crisp. How is that not enough proof? God never lied about the promise he made to Gideon by rescuing Israel, but Gideon still didn't believe it. Gideon still wanted this proof. Like I said, not just a third time, not just a second time, but a third time as well. He knows that God is with him, but yet he still doesn't believe. God gives us strength when we are weak and when we are fearful. There's no need to test God. There's no need to ask God for a sign multiple times, but yet Gideon did because he was doubtful, because he thought he would lose, because he was an overthinker, because he had a weak faith. That chapter right there was the introduction to Gideon and his initial fear and doubts, and this is also the rising action leading to the second chapter, chapter 7. And I think it would be a great cliffhanger to stop here, but I've been doing this for like 17 minutes, something like that. I don't know when I started talking, but 10:17 right now. So I think I'll just keep going, and plus I got like a couple pages left. So this is the next chapter, chapter 7, and probably the most famous part of this story and Gideon's story. Now, Gideon summoned this army of multiple clans, of multiple nations. 32,000 men came, and they were ready to fight. But let's look at chapter 7, verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore, tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home." So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. Seeing this army that Gideon had, so many people of different nationalities coming together to make up 32,000 people. That's a big army, but it wasn't as big as the army Midian had, which was 135,000 people. And so Gideon got up on stage, probably on a rock or a hill, telling all of these people, if you are timid or afraid, just go home. And then that message would have spread back to the last person. And then after he said that, seeing over 2/3 of his army leave must have been hard to see, must have hurt. And this right here was a great test of Gideon's faith. This army is too big. I already told you that you would win, so why do you have such a big army? And we see why this army is too big, because at the end of the day, when Israel is on top, they won't say it was through God, but it was through themselves. That is what they would say. God wanted the odds to be so bad. God wanted the odds to be so bad so the victory would clearly be his alone. But what we see is even more people leave. Verse 4. But the Lord told Gideon, "There are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not." And let's skip to verse 6. Only 300 of the men drank from their hands, and all the other got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. The ones who drank from their hands, they would stay, they would fight. And the rest were sent home. 10,000 was still too much for God's purpose. And God assured Gideon that victory was certain. Victory was already his from the beginning, even with 300 men, which is 300 men is less than 1% of his original army size. 32,000 men going to 300 men. That is about a 400-to-1 ratio between the Midianite army and the Israelite army. But Gideon was still uncertain. He was still lacking faith in God, which is what is said in verse 9. That night the Lord said, "Get up, go down to the Midianite camp, for I have given you victory over them. But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you will be greatly encouraged. Then you will be eager to attack." So Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. Whenever I first read Purah, I pronounced it Pura, and then I thought it was Pura, something like that, Puru. Then I finally had to see how to pronounce it correctly, Pura. Even when God told Gideon that victory is his, he still lacked faith. He wanted even more proof, but Gideon never specifically requested God for proof because God already knew. And he wanted to assure Gideon 4 times. 4 times Gideon lacked faith. I find your lack of faith disturbing. God gave Gideon 2 options here. You can attack now and win, or you can go down to the camp, hear what they are saying, and then attack later and win. Either way, you win. But what he heard is exactly what he needed to hear, even if God proved himself 3 times prior. Let's skip to verse 22. 22, when the 300 Israelites blew their ram's horns, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight each other with their swords. Those who were not killed fled to places as far away as Beth-shittah near Zerera, and to the border of Abel-Mahala near Tabith. Now, the Israelites here held ram horns, and they also held clay jars with torches in it. But this shows the victory God told Gideon multiple times. Victory was yours from the start. Don't you understand? How many times does Gideon need to hear something to learn it? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And now let's go to the end of this chapter, verse 25. They captured Oreb and Zeb, the 2 Midianite commanders, killing Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. and they continued to chase the Midianites. Afterward, the Israelites brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan River. This is a jam-packed story right here, and quite a violent one at that. We looked at the introduction of Gideon with his initial fear and doubts. Then Gideon's calling and victory over the Midianites, but we still have one chapter left. And I know some of you are, let's hurry up, Harrison, let's hurry up, come on. I know some of you might be thinking that. But we still have one chapter left. Lessons on trusting God's strength and our weakness and the fall of Israel again. Condensing 3 chapters into a single sermon is not very easy. It's long, it's hard. But we have to come to the last chapter with Gideon. So Gideon and his 300 men started chasing the ones who escaped the battle, which was about 15,000 men, which is still a lot compared to his 300 men. And soon they reached the town of Succoth, which is about 4.5 miles from the Jordan Valley. And he asked for some food there. Picking up chapter 8, verse 6. But the officials of Succoth replied, "Catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we will feed your army." So Gideon said, "After the Lord gives me victory over Zebah and Zalmunna, I will return and tear your flesh with the thorns and briars from the wilderness." What a turn of events right here. A man who wanted proof that he was talking to God, and he wanted proof that God was still with him, wanted to kill and torture this town, especially this man right here, because they denied him and his men food. We have seen a transformation with Gideon before. A young man becoming a warrior, and now we see another transformation here. A dangerous and violent transformation. And we see Gideon capture the 2 Midianite kings, and he brings them back to Succoth, verse 15. Gideon then returned back to Succoth and said to the leaders, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna. When we were here before, you taunted me, saying, 'Catch Zebah and Zalmunna first, and then we will feed your exhausted army.' Then Gideon took the elders of the town and taught them a lesson, punishing them with thorns and briars from the wilderness. He also tore down the tower of Peniel and killed all the men in the town." This is a very violent action that he did, and he fulfilled his promise. But going to verse 7, what he will do, to verse 16, there is a verb change. Verse 7, it says, "will beat or tear." And verse 16, it says, "teaching them a lesson." Just so that way his actions that he just committed to be justifiable, so that way it won't seem as bad. Teaching them a lesson. But he didn't stop there. After he captured the 2 kings, Gideon wanted his oldest son, Jethro, to kill Zebah and Zalmunna. But Zebah and Zalmunna wanted Gideon to kill them, so that is what he did. Stay with me now. We're almost done. 7 pages in. This is about the time whenever my washer was finished, and I had to transfer all my clothes into the dryer. But they wanted Gideon to kill them. I know it's a lot. Verse 22. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers, for you have rescued us from Midian." But Gideon replied, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you. However, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies." The enemies being Ishmaelites, all wore gold earrings. Now you notice that the Israelites turned to Gideon and asked him to be a ruler, which is a third title that Gideon didn't really think that he deserved. Hero, title of honor, and now a ruler. The desire for a human king to rule Israel started way back in the nation, early in the nation's history. And it wasn't until hundreds of years later when God gave them a king that they have been asking for, Jesus Christ. But Gideon responds in the most powerful way. "I will not rule over you, nor will my son or my grandson, but the Lord will." Despite freeing his people, he could have been a very, very powerful, a very wealthy king, but he gave all the glory to God. which is another transformation. Seeing a young man have weak faith, wanting proof multiple times that God is with him, that God is going to save him, to saying, I did not save you. I'm just an instrument. God saved you. He will be your ruler. That is the most powerful thing Gideon has ever said or could have said. But instead, Gideon only wanted one thing in return. That each person gives one gold earring from the plunder, which, after everyone has given in their share, sort of earring tax, that was about 1,700 shekels of gold, or in today's standards, about 43 pounds of gold, which comes out to be a little over $1.2 million today. Now we're almost done. Verse 27, Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. Now an ephod is a shirt-like garment that was worn by the priests of Israel, and he put it in his hometown where God first came to him. But all good things must come to an end. Israel soon went back to their old ways, worshiping false idols, worshiping the image of God, worshiping false idols and falling back into evil. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. But it's most apparent in the last three verses of this chapter, in the last three verses of Gideon's story. Verse 33. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping the image of Baal, making Baal Berith their god. They forgot the Lord their God, who had rescued them from all their enemies surrounding them, nor did they show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, despite all the good he had done for Israel. That's the end of the chapter. It's not a very happy ending. It's not like Cinderella. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. How many times do we have to do this dance? How many times do we need to reinforce that what you are doing is wrong? Baal is not a god. Only the Lord God, Yahweh himself, is the one true God. Israel served the memory of Gideon while he was alive, but as soon as he died, their loyalty died with him. And they went back to their old ways, worshiping this false idol. Now, whenever I think about that, two things come to mind. The first is that they didn't learn. Over so many times being hurt, being in pain, not learning from that. And the second is that they must like being in pain and like being in spiritual darkness. I know that this was a long sermon, going over 3 chapters. We looked at the introduction of Gideon and his initial fear and doubts, then Gideon's calling and victory over the Midianites, and finally, we looked over the lessons on trusting God's strength in our weakness and the fall of Israel again. We saw a man who had a weak faith, but despite that, he still trusted God, and from that, we can take that and apply it to ourselves. God is with us. God will not leave us, and God gives us strength when we are weak and when we are fearful. So as I wrap up, finally, some of you are thinking as you look at your watch to see how long I've been talking. As the worship band gets up here, when you go home, when you're in traffic, when you go to work, when you feel like nothing is going right, take a moment to be with God. I know you might overthink it, asking God for a sign and then questioning, hey, God, was that a sign from you? Or am I just overthinking? Can I get another sign? Just know that God is for you. God gives us strength when we are weak and when we are fearful. Don't make the same mistake multiple times. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Let's pray.